Hello students, welcome back to another session of Business Law and Ethics. Today we will be discussing on the topic MRTP Act. MRTP Act. So what does this MRTP stands for? MRTP stands for Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act. So in the Business Law and Ethics course, we have learned about many acts and the acts related to Income Tax Act, Customs Act, Companies Act, Industrial Regulation and Development Act. Like there are many acts we have learned. So one among them which is important in relation to the export import or in relation to the restrictive trade and monopolies, that is the Monopolies Restrictive Trade Practices Act. So we'll be learning about this act. Okay, so this Monopolies Restrictive Trade Practice Act came into force on 1st June in the year 1970, and the major aim was to prevent the concentration of economic power, provide for the control of monopolies and protect consumer interest. What do you mean by this monopolistic behavior? The monopolistic means when there is only one seller and there are many buyers in the market. So what happens, the marketer, the seller will be having a monopoly in the whole market and he can charge whatever price he wants because there is no other sellers, there is no option for the consumers. Then there will be a the marketer, the seller will be misusing the customers and all. So he will be squeezing out all the money from the consumers. So to protect the consumers and to prevent this single concentrated individual based marketing scenario, this MRTP Act came into existence in the year 1970. Okay, currently the MRTP Act has been renamed as Competition Act in 2002. So we have to we will be learning about Competition Act of 2002 also, because the MRTP is being renamed as, or an amendment is made on MRTP Act of 1970 and it is renamed as Competition Act of 2002. Okay, and there are certain changes, some additions have been made, that is certain amendments have taken place in the MRTP Act and finally it has been replaced as Competition Act of 2002. So what are the major objectives of MRTP Act? The major objectives are to ensure that the operation of economic system does not result in the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few. That is the major objective of MRTP is that the economic operation should not be concentrated in a single part or a single person or a single within a very few person. It should be spread, then only the development will happen. Next is to provide for the control of monopolies, to control the monopolies, to prohibit monopolistic and restrictive trade practices, so that there will be then the market, the free trade can be exhibited. If this MRTP came for to removal of the, or to prohibit the monopolistic and remove the monopolies control and to establish a free trade. After the amendment of the Act in 1984, the fourth objective was another objective. Like initially there in the MRTP Act of 1970 there were only 3 objectives, and later an amendment happened in the year 1984 and there was a 4th objective have been added, and the 4th objective is that it was to regulation of unfair trade practices. If there is malpractices or something happens like that, then the regulation of the unfair trade, if there is any kind of unfair trade happens, to regulate and to keep a watch into that. This is also taken care by MRTP. Okay, so which are the places where the MRTP Act is applicable? So the MRTP Act is extended to the all of India, including all of the India except Kashmir. But when the Competition Act of 2002 came, that is extended to all of the area of operation is extended to all over India, including the Jammu and Kashmir. But MRTP Act of 1970, the Jammu and Kashmir is not included in the act. So we will see which are the areas where the applicability of the MRTP Act exists. So this will not be existing in the areas, some of the organizations or some of the companies which are being controlled by the government of India. So any undertaking owned or controlled by government of India, this MRTP Act will not be existing. And the undertaking owned and controlled by government, as I told, the monopolistic means there will be only one individual seller or individual person who controls the whole market. In India, the government, the Indian Railway is the biggest example of the monopolistic, and since it is a government undertaking or owned by the government, this MRTP Act will not be applicable. So one of the most important example where this MRTP is not applicable is the Indian Railways. And even you check into the airways, there are many privatization happen, but in the railways there is no any kind of privatization or any kind of other things are happened. Only there is a single monopolistic exist, that is the central government, the Indian Railway. And it is so coming back to the topic, the MRTP Act is not applicable to any company undertaken or controlled by the government, company which is undertaken by the government or under the ownership of government, or any other any undertaking owned or controlled by government, or next category is any undertaking owned or controlled by the corporation. Okay, so these are the places where the MRTP is not applicable. Other than all those areas, the private and public areas, public companies, the MRTP Act is applicable. Now, any trade union or any other association of workmen or employees formed for their own reasonable protection as such a workmen or employees, any undertaking engaged in an industry, management of which has been taken over by any person or body or the persons under the power of central government, any undertaking owned by the cooperative society or any financial institution. So these are some more into the MRTP Act are if there is certain financial institution, they also will not be falling under the MRTP Act, and any cooperative societies or any other management industries which are being managed by the central government employees or central government powers are existing there, such places the MRTP Act will not be applicable. Okay, so this MTP, what does this MTP stands for? It was a monopolistic trade practices. Earlier the MTP existed, so to prohibit the MTP, that is monopolistic trade practice, the MRTP Act came, that is to restrict. So so the MTP, the monopolistic trade practice, is that which represents abuse of market power in production and marketing of goods and services by eliminating potential competitors, charging unreasonably high prices, preventing or reducing competition, limiting technical development, deteriorating products quality, etc. So these were the scenario earlier existed before MRTP Act came. So there was a monopolistic trade practice that was abusing or overutilizing the market, and they hold the powers in the market, so consumers were helpless. So the MRTP came to eliminate the potential competitors. Also, initially they used to charge unreasonably high prices. They the preventing or reducing competition, also limiting the technical development, because since if there is only one monopolistic existed, so only the changes can be made by the monopolistic, so it was also harming, so deterioration was happening. So to prevent all those things, MRTP came into existence. So what are the major drawbacks of MRTP? Yes, there are certain drawbacks exist in the MRTP Act. So the first one is poorly resourced commission. That was not a proper managed, or there was not a proper board who was taking care of this, even though there was an act existing. Inadequacy in dealing effectively with the anti-competitive practices due to lack of definitions, cumbersome procedures, and the scarce resources, because the procedures to be handled was cumbersome, like that was hectic, that was a little bit of the documental things was little bit hectic. That was the reason that it was technically an ineffective thing. Then sorry, absence of specification in identifiable anti-competition practices. Then anti-competition practices like cartels, predatory pricing, rigging, etc. are not specifically mentioned in the MRTP. So these were certain drawbacks of MRTP Act. At any time of drafting the MRTP Act, the Economic and Trade Millennium Prevent at that time constituted India only for its various provisions. However, ever since there has been considerable movement towards liberalization, privatization and globalization. That is in the new economic policy that happened in the year 1991, and we used to call that the LPG time. That is a liberalization, privatization and globalization happened during the periods of 90s, that is in 1991, where the new economic policy came into existence. Hence the law needed to yield to changing scenario of both the economic and trade. And regarding the conclusion, we will conclude the portion of MRTP as it can be said that the MRTP Act was successful to an extent, because initially there was a monopolistic existing in the market. So to control those monopolistic, MRTP was successful to an extent, but it was not fully successful because there were certain restrictions, there were certain technical inefficiencies all existed. So it was not fully successful, but for the time being that was successful for the time being. And however, due to scarcity of resources, lack of clearly defined procedures and cumbersome rules and regulation, the act wasn't that effective as supposed to be. And also the changing economic and trade environment made it necessary for the change in the MRTP Act into Competition Act of 2002. So we'll be learning about the Competition Act further in the upcoming session. So by this we wind up the session on MRTP. So if you feel any difficulties on MRTP, that is the Monopolies and Restricted Trade Practices Act of 1970. So if you feel any difficulty, get back to me, and thank you all.